when autistic and non-autistic people come together, there's potential for that mismatch. What can reduce that mismatch is obviously a fundamental question. And in a paper I wrote a few years back, I talked about interactional expertise, and another one I talked about interpersonal flow, and trying to grasp at this kind of how to improve this between autistic and non-autistic people. And one simple answer would just be time, practice and effort, and with some humility, so you're not jumping to conclusions about how other people are. But in practice, I think that's something which is actually quite rare. Something I've often commented on is the efforts that autistic people are putting in all day, every day to interact and make sense of the world is the kind of effort required by practitioners and parents and so on in understanding us back. And that is a lot of effort. But some over the time do it rather well, I'd say. I think parents, practitioners, often the more time they spend around autistic people, the more expertise they often gain. When looking at autism research though, how much time of research is actually spent with autistic people in autistic spaces? Have they even met some autistic people in certain areas of research? And I think this is a quite serious problem which all the debates at INSAR this year seem to have brought to the surface rather a lot.
This is a really good point, because in Montreal we were talking about the double empathy problem in terms of how participants, autistic or non-autistic, experience that. But I guess what you're pointing out, Damian, is that the double empathy problem can also be at a meta level, which is how do we produce knowledge about autism? How do researchers understand autistic experiences, and can that even be achieved if there aren't better ways for autistic people to be actually leading the research?
I think something which I very much champion, and I know others in the symposium do too, is more interdisciplinary work in the field and academia generally. And of course that's easier said than done, because every discipline has its own practice language, as it were, and everyone's using different jargon and meaning different things to it. So in a sense you have a double empathy problem between your neuroscientist and your artist trying to make sense of it all.
I think also they're in competition to some degree for funding. I find it interesting because people do talk about the need to be more interdisciplinary, but when you look at how is that structurally supported, it's not.
No, I would totally agree there. There's, I think, a big problem in how academic institutions are set up. Geographically, you tend to be in different buildings or different corridors, and you have very little time for cross-disciplinary work even within your own institution. And so it's not really properly encouraged by the very structures we have in academia. And journals can be part of that problem too, or conference events saying we only do this type of work here when you're the International Society for Autism Research. Surely if anyone's going to be interdisciplinary, that should be. And see the benefit of it. And if you look at the field of autism research, where the most push for this kind of thing is coming from is autistic people themselves and autistic academics, often struggling in their own careers. As examples, I chair myself the PARC group, or the Participatory Autism Research Collective, to promote participatory methods and work in the field, and also to promote interdisciplinary work. This was partly influenced by an earlier autistic-led project, the Autonomy Journal, which is an open access journal. Doesn't have a rating, a factor and so on, but it's autistic-led, open access, and within the title of the journal is interdisciplinary. So it's autistic scholars often who are saying what we need is for people to come together and share this knowledge across disciplines. And they're saying it's stronger than everyone else. And I think that's an interesting point in itself. We do have, I would say, non-autistic scholars and academics who are seeing the benefit of this and the need for it, especially if you're talking about social interaction and the space between people or the environments they're in. So I'm all for working with artists, designers, psychologists, sociologists and so on, and across disciplines. And so I'm also, as I said earlier, interested in predictive coding and working with neuroscientists. To me, I may not understand all these other disciplines so well at times, but trying at least is, I believe, produces better work with more impact that autistic people and their families and practitioners are going to relate to more. It's going to be more relevant to practice in everyday life, which I think is another issue in the current research landscape. So in order to do that, we need to build the structures and institutions that promote interdisciplinary working. So I was rather disappointed to see INSAR, it would seem, moving away or crawling back from that. And commentators saying things like making accommodations for autistic attendees as being political. It's political not to make those adjustments, more so in my view. So there's some real problems there and fears, I guess, on both sides and misunderstandings. So the way to break those down is to have more coming together. And I'm reminded of the work of Harry Collins, who I've referenced many times in my own work. And back in the 1990s, he used to run what he called peace workshops between scientists and sociologists to try and build understanding across disciplines. And it feels in the autism world that's where we are now. We need these comings together to work more productively. That was something that interested me in your work, Brett, was that perception of helping others when the real world actions didn't seem to support that. People's beliefs about themselves. And that reminds me of what I was saying earlier about people repairing the dissonance, or as Harold Garfinkel used to say, the breach in the natural attitude. And so they're rationalising to themselves, making themselves feel better about the situation when actually not acting upon it. And that's rather worrying, thinking about how that translates into practice especially with autistic people who are less verbal in care homes, that kind of thing. If people believe they're helping and empathising and really not, and they're telling themselves that they're doing a good job, which is a very human thing to do, when actually you might be missing out or creating problems for people. So I think that's a really important thing to look into more, and what actually changes helping behaviours, if you like. And doing this kind of practice work is going to have a real impact on people's lives. I think another interesting point was the methodology, and I thought it was quite creative in how he did that. And I think it will take quite creative methods in order to be able to examine these things further, and trying to standardise it in some way is a very difficult thing to do, but something you managed in that setup. And just doing more experiments like that would be interesting, and I think that was mentioned in the first podcast, about if the helping of the supposed other person helped them succeed, how the attributions are made. Because I think that is going to be an interesting area just in itself, and differences in what attributions are made by autistic and non-autistic people about a situation. So in any given context, what's salient, what's interesting, what's meaningful could be quite different. So what we attribute to people or situations are going to be different. So that's another way of testing the double empathy problem out in the future. Just a general agreement with everyone that although this has been talked about by autistic people since the early 1990s as an issue, and that thing of we've been saying this for years, I would agree with the others that this does need proper rigorous testing and looking at from different disciplines and different angles, and because the nuances of why these mismatches occur, I think, are still quite up for debate, and how diverse these might be, and breakdowns in interactions between autistic people, which do happen and can be quite severe breakdowns in my anecdotal experience. Why do those happen? So there's further nuance to this, which I think further work can only be a good thing. And lastly, just where I started from, and applauding everyone for the work they're doing and driving this topic area forward.